Hello everybody. So I wanted to come on today and do a little video about swatching. The reason being is I've just been swatching for a new project and I needed to do 2 swatches, and it got me thinking back to when I was a new knitter and I heard swatching so many times, but I never really understood what that meant. So I did sort of understand that you needed to do a 4-inch square, but I didn't really know much else beyond that. So I wanted to come and do this video just in case there's any new knitters out there that also feel the same. We don't all know everything, and I know I certainly didn't at the start, and it took me quite a while to figure some of this stuff out for myself. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about swatching. So a swatch is something that a pattern will call for. When you buy a pattern, it will give you a gauge swatch in the pattern. That's usually a 4-inch square of knitting. We're talking about knitting here, not crochet. So it's usually a 4-inch square of knitting. You would knit your square slightly bigger so you can measure a good 4 inches. And the reason that we swatch is every knitter knits to a different gauge. Some knitters are really loose knitters, some knitters are really tight knitters, and some knitters are right in the middle. I know that I'm quite a tight knitter. I've usually got to go up a needle size in most patterns. But if you start a pattern and you haven't done a gauge swatch and your gauge does not match that designer's gauge, your finished measurements for that your finished measurements for that garment are going to be wrong. So this is the reason we do it. And I've been notorious in the past for not doing a gauge swatch, getting a pattern, casting on with the recommended needles, sometimes just winging it and going up a needle size, and then my finished garment is not the same measurements as it's supposed to be. And then you just don't wear it, or, you know, it'll fit one of your kids. It's just very disappointing if you've spent weeks and weeks making something and it just doesn't fit. So what is a gauge swatch? Well, I have 2 here. This is my first one. I'm going to talk about what gauge I needed for the pattern I was making. I'm not going to tell you what the pattern was, and I'm not giving any information out about the pattern. That information is readily available on the Ravelry page. So I won't be giving out any numbers from the pattern that I'm making, but this is my first gauge swatch. Now the pattern recommended 6mm needles, and it recommended, I have it written down, the pattern recommended 15 stitches per 4 inches and 21 rows. So I have knit this 4-inch square. It is slightly larger than 4 inches, so I've got a good space to measure within the square. If you're knitting in the round, you can knit your swatch in the round as well. That's for a different video. We're just going to be basically talking through swatching today. So this is my first swatch. Now I've knit this on the recommended needles, and the pattern calls for 15 stitches per 4 inch. So when you are measuring for your stitches, first of all, you don't hold it up like I'm holding it up. You put it onto a flat surface. You can actually get gauge swatch rulers, which are like a wooden square with an L shape cut out of it, and that makes it really easy to measure. But I've never had one of those, so I just use a ruler. So you would lay your swatch on a flat surface. You would get your 4-inch measure. So here, I can't see that backwards, but you'd get your 4 inches and you'd count the stitches in that 4 inches. And then you would do the same for the rows. You would take a 4-inch measure and you would count how many stitches per row you've got in that 4 inches. And that's how you do your gauge swatch. Once you've knit your gauge swatch, before you measure it, you're going to want to wash it and block it and dry it so you can see what the fabric does. Another good reason is you can see how the fabric feels. You can see, like for me, I really wanted to do this swatch because I'm using yarn that I've not used before, and I was really concerned about how itchy it was going to be. So I've knit my swatch, I've blocked it, and I've just popped this just on my top there, and I've walked around with it to see if it's going to annoy me, because that's where I'm really sensitive around my neck. So as long as I've sort of got it here, I've been able to see if it's been annoying. But you can see what your fabric's done, and that's after obviously it's been blocked, so it's stretched a little bit. That's where your true measurements are. So First swatch, I've done all of the things I'm supposed to do. I've knit my 4-inch square, I've washed it, I've blocked it, it's now dry. I'm happy with the fabric. Let's see how many stitches we've got. So I needed 15 stitches per 4-inch and 21 rows. So once I've measured this swatch, I've actually got 18.5 stitches per 4 inches and I've got 22 rows. So I know that my gauge is not matching the designer's. It's only 3.5 stitches. Does it really make that much of a difference? It really, really does. So had I gone ahead with this, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit further on, had I gone ahead with this swatch and knit using the 6mm needles and cast on the large, which is the usual size that I would cast on, my pattern calls for 5 inches of positive ease. I would have actually ended up with a garment 2 inches too small based on this swatch. So although it's only 3.5 stitches out, it makes a huge difference to the finished measurements of your garment. So I've not got enough, well, I've got far too many stitches per 4 inches. I've got 18.5 and I needed 15 stitches. So I went up to a 6.5mm needle. I did the same thing again. I did another gauge swatch using the same number of stitches cast on, 4-inch square again, washed it, blocked it, dried it. I still like the feel. You can see this is a slightly looser gauge. Now, it's supposed to be a loose gauge on the garment that I'm making. It is knit at a loose gauge. So I can see that this is more the effect the designer was going for. I've measured this again and my gauge is perfect. So on this swatch, I have 15 stitches per 4 inch and I have 21 rows. So that's perfect. Everything's worked out. I've just gone up a needle size. I've matched the designer's gauge. So I know when I knit this product now, I'm going to get the same measurements that the designer got. Now, that was the information I knew prior. The next bit is the information that I didn't know, and that's the bit that I want to have a little bit of a chat about, because what happens if you can't get gauge? I've had it before where I've still been a stitch or so out and not managed to get gauge. So what do you do in that situation? Because you know that it's going to make a difference to the finished garment. Maybe if it's a stitch, it won't make that much of a difference, but it depends what size you're making, and it depends how many stitches overall that's going to make a difference to. So let's say when I knit this gauge, the pattern had called for 15 stitches per inch and I only got 14. That's as close as what I can get. So I've got 14 stitches per inch. The row gauge is not too concerning because you can always add more rows, but this width gauge, although you do need to try and match the row gauge, it's not as much of a problem. The stitch gauge for the width is. So let's say for this swatch, I only got 14 stitches. How do I work out what size I'm going to get on 14 stitches? Right, so this is the bit that I wish I'd have known sooner than I did. So you've got your 4-inch square. I have got 14 stitches per 4 inch. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is find out how many stitches I'm getting per inch, not per 4 inch. So I take that 14 stitches per 4 inches and I divide that by 4. And that tells me that I'm getting 3.5 stitches per 1 inch of fabric. So all I've done is I've taken my 4-inch gauge swatch. My stitch count was 15 inches. I've divided that by 4, which is 3.5 inches. And that's how many stitches per inch of fabric I'm going to be getting. Now, let's just say, for example, these numbers are not the numbers from my pattern. I'm just giving you an example. Let's just say the designer is asking for 3 inches of positive ease. I'm a 39-inch bust. So I would be knitting my garment to 42 inches. So if I times that 3.5, which is how many stitches I've got per inch, if I times that by 42 inches, because that's how many inches the finished garment needs to be, that tells me the total stitches I'm going to need for the bust part of my finished garment. So that's 147 stitches. So when you're knitting a garment, they tend to be knit top down. So that's the example I'm going to be using. So you look at your pattern, you've looked ahead on the pattern, and what you want to look at is the stitch number for after you've separated for the sleeves. Prior to that, you're going to have sleeve stitches. After you've separated for the sleeves is where you've got your bust measurements. That's how big it's going to be for your bust. And that's the stitch count that you want to be looking at. So I know, based on this swatch, I need 147 stitches at that point. So I'm going to look ahead in the pattern and I'm going to try and get that 147 stitches as close to one of those numbers as I can. So you go to your pattern, you then go, after you've separated for your sleeves and whatever you've got left in that pattern, and you look for the number that's closest to 147 stitches, and that would be the size that you need to knit. That might not be the size that you originally wanted to cast on, but that's the measurements that you need to knit. I hope that makes sense to some people out there. That's the information that I never knew. And it became really, really apparent on a previous project that I've recently made. If you've been watching the podcast, you know that I'd made these scrappy leggings, which were my favourite project ever. And I absolutely loved them. They were a fantastic pattern. But the pattern itself was a wide leg leggings, or they were pants, wide leg pants, and I wanted leggings. I wanted these pants to be leggings and tight all the way down my leg. Now, in order to do that, I just used my own gauge. So for that particular pattern, I was getting 7 stitches per inch of fabric. So all I needed to do was measure my top of my thigh, above my knee, below my knee, my calf and my ankle, all the way down my leg. I gave myself 2 inches of negative ease. So let's say, for example, above my knee, I needed it, my knee, measured 24 inches, just for example. I wanted a piece of fabric that was 22 inches, so I had a bit of negative ease to pull the pants in. So I was looking for a piece of fabric 22 inches. I knew I had 7 stitches per inch. So all I did is I times that 7 by 22, and that gave me 154 stitches. So I knew at the top of my knee I needed to have 154 stitches. As I worked down the pants, let's say for example I only measured at 20 inches, so I wanted 18 to have that negative ease. I would then do 7 for that's how many stitches per inch, times 18, which was the size of the fabric that I needed, and that was 126 stitches. There we go, 126 stitches. You can even see the dog in the phone there, and Stuart's at the window. So I needed 126 stitches by the time I got to below my knee. So I could just decrease accordingly based on my own stitch gauge and what I needed for the needles that I was using. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope that it does. It took me such a long time as a new knitter to figure that information out. It's not readily available. And when you get a pattern and you're so excited to start a pattern, it just gives you a gauge swatch, and it doesn't really explain to you what happens if maybe you can't get gauge, or what happens if you want less positive ease. That's where this swatch will tell you everything, because you can use your own gauge for how many stitches per inch. By dividing this number by 4, you will get your stitches per inch, and then you can work out exactly how many stitches you would need based on the gauge that you've got. And if you match the designer's gauge, then perfect. You don't have to do any maths at all. But it's really easy maths, and this little square will tell you everything you need to know. And I've joked so many times in the past about being in the anti-swatch club and being the leader of the anti-swatch club. And that's all in jest. It really is, because I do actually swatch when needed. I don't swatch for some things. If it's maybe a shawl or something, I won't swatch. But for a garment where it's more specific, I will make sure I swatch. And not even just for gauge, just to see what the finished fabric's going to feel like and how I'm going to like it once it's washed and blocked. So I've had this yarn in my stash for quite some time, and I've always thought, oh, it's itchy, I'm not going to like it. But actually, now I've swatched with it, you can see I've held it together with another yarn, and I've washed it and blocked it. It's fine. So yeah, I hope that information was helpful to somebody. I hope I've not just confused you more. If you've got any questions, just leave me a comment. I will see you on the next video, everybody.